Hello and welcome back once again to CBR MTG. My name is Angus Mackay and today we're going to be doing another Highlander deck tech. I'm joined here by Phillip Nicholson.
Hello.
And today we're talking about Phil's other baby. You may have seen in our previous videos the Tribal Warriors, a brew of Philip's own creation. And now we're going to delve deeper into another one of his prized possessions, the Green-Black Pox. So, Phil, what is Green-Black Pox? What does your deck do? And I'm sorry, what is the correct name?
Well, the correct name is obviously That's So Ravenscram, because it is very Ravenscram. The deck is here to make your opponent sad. You want to deny your opponent the ability to participate in the game by removing all of their lands, all of the cards in their hand, all of their creatures, ideally all three at the same time. Reduce them into a state where they can't participate in the game, and then after you've done that, you can figure out a way for you to actually win.
And I think we mentioned this off cam, you don't have to be happy, you just have to have your opponent be less happy than you.
Exactly, you want them more sad than you are.
It makes you happy by comparison. So Pox is a nutshell, Pox in a nutshell rather, is based off the card Smallpox, by the namesake, where it's 2 mana sorcery, black, which says each player loses 1 life, discards a card, and sacrifices a creature, then sacrifices a land. This strategy has been used across all formats, if I'm not mistaken, besides probably Standard.
I have no idea if it was ever played in Standard. I didn't play Standard in any era in which any Pox card was legal.
It's probably for the right reasons, because it doesn't look like a lot of fun to play against, but it definitely looks like a lot of fun to play. You'll see it in Legacy, very common as a mono black Pox deck, as well as Modern. It's got some fringe playability. This one kind of hits on like a slightly different angle. To start us off, Phil, what are your points? How did you point this deck?
The current points this deck is playing is Strip Mine, Wasteland, Fastbond, which is 4, and then you're just filling out the other 3 points with Mox Jet, because it casts Hemstorak, Smallpox, Sinkhole, all those cards just a little bit faster. You can instead play Soul Ring over the Mox, which means instead of casting those double black spells faster, you're casting your 4 drops like Smokestack a bit earlier, but I think the other 4 points are pretty set in stone.
It's kind of like a hotly contended issue on the point structure of Strip Mine and Wasteland, but your deck is not using it fairly at all. It's using Life from the Loam, and I guess Regrowth as well, but also sort of Crucible of Worlds and your Randomap Excavator to get recursion from the strip mine and the Wasteland. And this gives you a slight, it's a combo, right? It's using Fastbond and Crucible of Worlds to strip block your opponent out of the game. Which is something that you probably won't get in any other format, and it's definitely a reason. Well, I suppose it can be played in Vintage technically, but because Fastbond is a 1 mana enchantment that allows you to put as many lands as you want in 1 turn, you can basically pay 1 damage to play Strip Mine, strip their other land, and then their other land, and then their other land, and then that basically wins the game by itself, because your opponent's basically locked into playing all their lands, if they ever draw them, as Lotus Petals.
There's not much in other formats where you've really got the same level of land destruction and recursion. You can obviously do similar things in Legacy, but you only get Wasteland, not Strip Mine. So your opponent is typically going to have access to basics unless you have other spells to supplement your Wasteland. So yeah, it's definitely a very Highlander centric strategy.
Yeah, something that's very common in Highlander strategies, but not very common anywhere else, is Zuranorb as well. So Zuranorb lets you sacrifice a land to gain 2 life. If you have any of your Crucible effects out on the battlefield, it's infinite life.
Yeah.
Because you have the Fastbond to pay 1 life, and the Zuranorb to gain you 2 life. So that's infinite mana and infinite strip blocking.
It also means if you have other lands that tap to do something, whatever that might be, you can do that as much as you want. It does a lot of things. Also, if Zuranorb, if you just play against aggro, sometimes you can just cast Zuranorb and it buys you a lot of time. It's a really miserable card for them to deal with. There's also definitely instances where you cast Titania and you cast Zuranorb, and then you don't have any lands anymore, and then you kill your opponent.
Yeah, that's right. One of the your threat package, I mean, it's very light. Like what you because of the Pox strategy, how you win the game is not necessarily relevant.
Really, the big threats are just Titania, which returns a land from your graveyard when she comes in, and whenever a land you control dies, you get a 5/3 elemental. Obviously, incredible with Strip Mine and Wasteland, really solid with fetch lands.
And that was the combo that you mentioned before with Zuranor, where
Yeah.
you sacrifice your whole board, make a bunch of 5/3s, and then kill your
Yeah,
opponent.
there's also similar things where you play Titania and just for a bit of extra power, you Strip Mine yourself instead of your opponent. Or you do some silly things with Dust Bowl where you like target the land you sacrifice, just to like make sure you're getting the right amount of power without destroying all your lands or destroying as many lands as you need to. Titania adds a lot of damage,
Yeah.
but she's also just got the powerful land recursion synergies that the deck wants. Kind of the next thing that's a threat would be Nissa Vital Force,
Okay.
which are a bit less of a staple, but a 5-drop Planeswalker that ticks up to untap lands and turn them into 5/5s until end of turn with haste, so you can't accidentally choose the land that you played this turn. It's okay. -3s to return a permanent from your graveyard to hand. The deck is playing a very large number of very powerful permanents.
Yep.
And that down tick is incredibly important. And then her ultimate, which is actually quite relevant because she can do it the second turn she's in play, gives you an emblem with whenever at a land enters the battlefield under your control, you can draw a card.
Yeah, which is super relevant with, of course, Crucible of Worlds and Fastbond essentially drawing you infinite cards.
Even just fetch lands, every fetch land now draws you 2 cards,
Yeah.
which is pretty nutty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then everything else in the deck that can win the game, the fact that it can win the game is kind of a secondary thing that it does. It's not really there to win the game, it's there for a different purpose, and it just happens to be a creature with around 2 power.
Before the Life from the Loam strategy, kind of doing the sort of fairer version of the Crucible lock. I mean, we noticed before that you had Volrath Stronghold as part of your land package, so essentially you can be basically empty-handed, dredge Life from the Loam to fill your graveyard, cast it to get lands back into your hand, which is obviously good with smallpox effects where you have to discard your own cards. But then you can also fairly get back your Wasteland, play your Wasteland, waste them, and then that's basically all you're doing every turn. And that fills up your graveyard so you can get back Volrath Stronghold and then get back a creature with that strategy as well. So you can see the deck is extremely synergistic and uses that graveyard recursion basically to the best of its abilities.
Yeah, I mean, Life from the Loam is also very powerful with the cycling lands in Tranquil Thicket and Barrenmoor.
Yep.
Letting you kind of Life from the Loam as well as draw a card every turn is pretty powerful.
Yep.
There's also just a couple of other utility lands that you're playing to work with your recursion package. You're playing 3 creature lands in Hissing Quagmire, Treetop Village, and Mistress Factory. I've toyed with playing Mutavault various times. It's not in the list at the moment, but it certainly has been before and could be in the future. And then the other utility land that I'm currently playing, besides the ones that destroy lands, is Cabal Pit.
Yep.
Which is a land that taps for black and deals a damage to you, or has Threshold, which is if you have 7 cards in your library, you can play black and tap and sacrifice Cabal Pit to give a creature -2/-2 until end of turn. Which is when you can recur it, it's a pretty powerful form of removal, even if it does only to give -2/-2. I've also had a situation with a Ramunap Excavator and Fastbond where I Cabal Pitted 5 times in the same turn, which it hurt a little bit, but sometimes it's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does cost you a little bit of life to make that happen, but when you're trying to strip your opponent of as many resources as possible, just paying that amount of life to take away your opponent's only threat is particularly relevant.
Yeah, definitely.
There's also part of the thing that we haven't talked about. There's a pretty huge part of the Pox strategy in general is Smokestack and Smokestack effects. So why don't you go through maybe the big sort of Smokestacky-esque cards and the cards that also basically fill that role of not let your opponent play out their game plan.
Sure. So the big 2 would be Smokestack and Braids, both of which essentially result in each player sacrificing a permanent in their upkeep. And then to fuel them, as well as playing your land recursion, the big things you're playing are Bitter Blossom and Ophiomancer to generate a steady supply of tokens that you can feed to those cards as much as you want. Kind of an honorable mention goes to the world enchantments in the Abyss and Nethervoid. The Abyss destroying a non-artifact creature in each player's upkeep, and Nethervoid mana leaks every spell. So the Abyss is really powerful in this deck because you're only playing 5-6 creatures, 6 in the current list. So it's very rarely actually hurting anything you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And a lot of those creatures even actually find the Abyss. You know, something like a Theomancer, even Eternal Witness. It doesn't really matter if it gets killed by the Abyss.
Ophiomancer, for anyone who doesn't know, and I think this is like worth pointing out because it's actually kind of a Highlander staple at this point. Ophiomancer being a 3-mana 2/2 that says at the beginning of each upkeep, if you control no snakes, put a snake onto the battlefield. No other snake synergies. There's nothing to do with snake tribal in here at all. But that recursion that you get with with Smokestack to just sacrifice the snake, and then in your next turn you get the snake back. It's kind of a combo.
Yeah, definitely. It's very good with Smokestack. It's very good with Braids. It also is just an incredibly good blocker because you get your first snake in your opponent's upkeep if they don't have an instant speed removal spell for it, which means that anything they want to attack with is attacking into a 1/1 with Death Touch that you're just going to get back in your turn.
Yeah.
So.
And also, Death Touch is so relevant as well.
Definitely. Means that it can trade with almost anything as long as that thing doesn't have first strike, basically.
Yeah. You've chosen Pox, and we mentioned it's fun to make other people not have fun.
Yeah.
But how do you feel that Prison? How do you feel like Prison is in the current meta, and how do you think it faces off against the field?
I think it's got a pretty decent matchup against a lot of things. So your control matchup is pretty solid because of your land destruction and your hand disruption, both of which, for the vast majority of it, pair up pretty well against what control is trying to do. So like something like Ravenscram, for example, your opponent countering Ravenscram is just not very good.
Yep.
If you've got like a Ravenscram Life from the Loam engine going, it's pretty good against control. And then the same is true of, Life from the Loam with Strip Mine or Wasteland. Unless they've got some kind of play where they play out a creature and then they temper you out, countering your Life from the Loam, they're never gonna really get rid of it very easily. You're also pretty well situated against a lot of creature decks because you're playing a pretty hefty amount of creature hate. You're playing a pair of Wraths, you're playing a bunch of edict effects and some spot removal, and you're playing cards like the Abyss. You're just really stopping that from happening, and you've got hand disruption to fight against combo. I think the worst matchups are things. The two big ones would be something like Red Black Burn, where they just have a really high density of cards they can cast for 1 mana, and also cards that deal damage directly to your face without requiring creatures.
Yeah.
Which can be very problematic, especially in pre-boarded games, because a lot of the kind of mid-rangey green cards that fight against the strategy, cards like Kitchen Finks and things, are creatures, so you don't want to play the main board because they're so anti-synergistic with what your deck is trying to do in other matchups, but you just need to have access to that kind of incidental life gain creature for that matchup.
Yeah.
And then the other one that can be rough is some mid-range decks, so something like an opposing Ophiomancer or a Lingering Souls or an enemy Kitchen Finks, cards like that, if you don't have the right hate pieces, you can end up in a situation where your Smokestack is more damaging to you than it is to your opponent if they have a pretty solid way of feeding it, because the deck is actually kind of light on ways to feed a Smokestack. You're mostly just hoping that it's worse for your opponent than it is for you.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. I wanted to talk about this aspect of your deck specifically because it's very common with Pox decks, and especially yours as well, where edict effects are one of the main sort of portions of removal. With small Pox, as we mentioned before, forcing each opponent to sacrifice a creature, you've actually got quite a few edict effects in your deck. Something that's really relevant is how it pairs up against True Name Nemesis, which is a card that is very prevalent in the format. One of the most, if you listen to the 7 Point Highlander podcast, is the most 1 point, the most played 1 point card in the format, and edict effects basically the best way to get rid of it. Also, not really affecting you in any way as bad as it affects your opponent.
Yeah, so you can play basically like wraths and multi-sided edicts. So you're playing Damnation and Toxic Deluge, as well as Smallpox, which has each player sacrifice a creature, and Innocent Blood, which just says each player sacrifice a creature for 1 mana. So those kind of symmetrical effects, if you don't have any creatures in play, they're much less symmetrical. And then you're also playing Liliana of the Veil, which ticks down to edict your opponent. And then there's another edict in the form of Chainers in the sideboard.
Yeah,
just in those matchups where you really want another piece of removal.
And I think that really pairs up in your favor quite well, because some of the best decks in the format are very much removal. They're packed full of removal. Everyone's playing the correct amount of removal. So to sort of counter that, or to help prevent that, a lot of people are playing evasive or hard to deal with creatures.
Yeah.
And then the spells to back it up. But you're hitting on sort of a different aspect to that, where you're like next leveling your opponent by, they're putting all their effort into putting a Yidris on the battlefield, or putting a giant threat like a True Nemesis, as mentioned before. And a lot of the time in those really grindy matchups, an opponent will only have one win con, like maybe a Gurmag Angler or something, where they play it and hope that it will take them away, but that falls right into your plan of the sacrifice effects, which I think are really important.
Yeah, definitely. I also think it's kind of interesting because that you mentioned the low density of creatures in the deck, making your opponent's kind of removal spells occasionally a bit weaker. It's actually really awkward to sideboard against, because while removal can be weaker against the deck because they're not playing very many creatures, the creatures you need to kill, you definitely need to kill. You can't let a Braids or a Ramanov Excavator or a Titania or an Atheomancer just sit around uncontested. You have to be able to deal with them. So it's a really awkward conundrum of just how much removal can you really afford to leave in, and how much removal can you really afford to take out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good point. Speaking of going into the post board, maybe we should talk about your sideboard and how it's structured, and what you bring in against specific matchups and what you take out.
Sure. So the cards in the sideboard are Nihil Spellbomb, Grafdigger's Cage, Nature's Claim, Chain of the Edict, Seal of Primordium, Tireless Tracker, Kitchen Finks, Maelstrom Pulse, Inquisition of Kozilek, Assassin's Trophy, Obstinate Bailiff, Courser of Crewfix, Trinisphere, Flaying Tendrils, and Duress. So you've got Nihil Spellbomb and Grafdigger's Cage are pretty obviously for any matchup where your opponent's going to be utilizing the graveyard a lot. Grafdigger's Cage, despite your deck being very graveyard heavy, barely hurts you at all. You can't retrace Ravenscrime if there's a Grafdigger's Cage in play, and other than that, it does nothing negative to your game plan, which is quite nice.
Yep. I was thinking Life from the Loam, but Life from the Loam gets lands, and Grafdigger's Cage specifically says creatures or spells.
Yep. So you can Life from the Loam as much as you want. You can play your lands with Crucible as much as you want. You can just have a great time. Yeah.
Grafdigger's Cage also has that incidental relevance against library-based cheaties. So like stuff like Natural Order and Collector Company get there, as well as Oath of Druids.
The big one is that you want to bring it in against Flashhawk.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
So all of those decks you want to bring it against. Also hitting Oath of Druids if your opponent is on Reanimator and they want to play Oath of Druids, the fact that it deals with that as well is very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then kind of the next pieces, and I think are important, are Nature's Claim and Seal of Primordium, which are just there to deal with whatever artifacts and enchantments your opponent might throw your way. Despite being a 2-color deck, you can sometimes be a bit weak to Blood Moon. You're playing a lot of lands that are non-basic and are very important in their utility. You're playing a bunch of creature lands, a bunch of, you want your Strip Mine and your Wasteland to do what they're supposed to do.
Yep.
So being able to get rid of a Blood Moon is usually pretty important. And there's also just other cards that a lot of decks play that you just might want to be able to get rid of annoying artifacts and enchantments. It's good to have a package that does that. You've got your Chainer's Edict, which is just a little extra piece of spot removal against a lot of decks, particularly ones that are playing cards like True Name. But even just something like elves, just having another piece of creature removal is nice.
Yep.
You've got your Kitchen Finks, your Obstinate Baloth, and your Corsair Prefix, which are all kind of just incidental life gain creatures. Which are all good against, burn heavy aggro decks or even just aggro decks in general. The Corsair Prefix is also fine in a lot of mid-range matchups because it generates you card advantage. Tireless Tracker is there for those matchups as well. Also can be against control if you think they've sideboarded out a lot of that pinpoint removal, or you're just happy to have another must deal with threat. Tireless Tracker is very good at stealing away a game with its synergy. The clue tokens are also really, really good with Smokestack and Breads.
Oh yeah,
because you can sacrifice the clues to those. And doing so does still pump the Tireless Tracker, because Tireless Tracker just sees you sacrifice a clue, it doesn't care how.
Oh, that's
so
very interesting.
A pretty important synergy to note. You've got your Maelstrom Pulse and your Assassin's Trophy. So these can deal with any permanent. So if you have problem enchantments or artifacts or whatever that you're worried about, you can bring these in. But they're mostly there to deal with planeswalkers. So the deck can have a bit of problems with planeswalkers, particularly ones like if they cost a small amount and they're coming out before you've managed to deny your opponent mana, because your deck is so threat light, you can't pressure planeswalkers properly. So something like an Ashiok or a Dak Faden can come down before you can stop your opponent having mana properly and can present a real problem. So having a few more ways beyond just Abrupt Decay or attacking with Treetop Village to properly pressure a planeswalker is very important. And then you've got Inquisition of Kozilek, Duress, and Trinosphere, which are kind of just your anti combo cards. So Kozilek, Inquisition of Kozilek and Duress are pretty flexible in what they do. Trinosphere is mostly just for things like Storm or Channel Mirror, but any deck, combo deck that's trying to cast 2 or more spells in one turn, Trinosphere is great against, and it doesn't really hurt your game plan that much. You're not playing too many things that you're really worried about costing 3.
And also half your game plan is slowing the game down to the point where you can get slow card advantage anyway. So playing 1 spell a turn, it costing you maybe 2 more at the very least is like kind of not really a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. And then the last card in the deck list is the Flaying Tendrils, which is a sorcery from Oath of the Gatewatch, which says all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn, and if a creature would die, it gets exiled instead. So it's just another wrath to have against the really hard aggro decks. So something like Black Red Burn, or just any deck where you think that they're going to play a lot of creatures that are Flaying Tendrils. Flaying Tendrils is great. If you've got not so much of the recurring creatures from the Black Red deck and more things like elves, you can play Drown in Sorrow instead. Scry 2 is pretty good. So Flaying Tendrils also has a nice advantage in that it doesn't kill your Excavator or your Titania. So a bunch of your creatures do dodge the tendrils as well, which is pretty nice to have on a Wrath.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I think this deck you definitely have to be a specific type of person to want to pick this deck up. But as we mentioned before, outside of the sort of pretty expensive the black enchantments that I think are probably relevant, maybe a little bit hard to find, but there's always someone in some community that would have at least one of them.
The Abysses is very common, and in my experience, not super difficult to borrow. Nether Void is a lot harder.
Okay. Something to keep in mind. Obviously, you can play like a less effective version of the same deck by cutting those cards, but besides, once again, formats like Highlander, and you'll see as a sort of recurring theme in the deck is that the mana base and then a couple of cards are very expensive. And then the rest is like pretty cheap. So you can buy nearly the whole deck for like maybe $1,000, and then you start looking at the mana base, start getting pretty expensive. But and the little bits and bobs that make this deck truly expensive. But besides that, like it's pretty easy to get into, at least to get the whole bulk, and then the rest of it's community outreach.
Yeah, I mean a lot of it is pretty cheap. Kind of after the lands and the Mox, the big thing you're looking at is the Mox Diamond, which you can honestly just not play. You can just play another piece of interaction or something like that instead. And then you're looking at, I think, Liliana of the Veil is probably the next most expensive card, which is just a great format staple.
Yeah,
for not just
multi-format
Highlander,
staple,
but
yeah.
every format she's legal in. So
Yeah, I think, I mean, you could play Chromox as well, but there's like, of course, the format is also highly sort of customizable.
Yep.
You kind of make little changes depending on what suits you and what you like more. So there's many different changes that you can make to make the deck suitable. But I think this is a really good deck to showcase, and a deck that kind of off the wall and not what you would expect from what we usually show as the Highlander format, but making some waves in the local Canberra scene. So hopefully we'll see more black-red Pox out in the universe.
well, it's definitely black and green, not
Black and green, of course. The other color.
Yeah.
My name is Angus Mackay. This has been CBR MTG's Highlander Deck Tech series. Please like, comment, and subscribe as usual. We do these sort of ad hoc depending on who we can get on the show. But thank you so much, Phillip Nicholson, for joining us to show off your deck.
No problem.
And we will see you next time.